Hey there, welcome back to another slow, sleepy stroll through the back alleys of history. The ones they don't teach in school, usually for good reason. Tonight, we'll be opening the creaky lid on something very close to the human experience. Food. But not the romantic candlelit kind. No, we're going to talk about the weird stuff. The fermented stuff. The why would you even try to eat that kind of stuff. Before we begin, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these little nightly journeys. And drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always oddly comforting to know we're all a little bit sleepless together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe tuck yourself into your favorite blanket burrito. Put the phone on Don't Disturb unless the house is on fire mode. And let's start with a tale of dinner in the time before cutlery, refrigerators, or common sense. Let's begin in ancient Rome, a place famous for its roads, its emperors, and its complete disregard for subtlety. It was also home to a condiment that modern noses would consider a war crime. It was called garum, and it was the crown jewel of Roman cuisine. What was garum, you ask? Picture this. Take a barrel, fill it with fish guts. Add salt. Leave it in the sun for a few weeks, maybe months. Stir occasionally. Eventually, the whole thing liquefies into a golden brown soup of fermented fish juice. Then you bottle it, sell it, and drizzle it on absolutely everything. Caesar's salad needs more garum. Birthday feast, garum. Breakfast porridge, garum. Gladiator post-game snack? You better believe it. Now, to be fair, garum wasn't just a weird Roman prank. It was genuinely beloved. It was considered refined, luxurious, and, depending on the quality, could cost a small fortune. In fact, entire coastal towns thrived off garum production. Factories were built just for the purpose of fermenting fish parts in bulk. Imagine working in one of those on a hot summer day. You'd go home smelling like Neptune's laundry hamper. But here's the twist. Garum was actually pretty clever. The fermentation broke down proteins into amino acids like glutamate, which, in modern terms, means umami. That rich, savory taste we now associate with soy sauce, mushrooms, or that fifth mysterious Dorito flavor. So yes, it smelled like Poseidon's gym socks, but it tasted amazing. Supposedly. When the Roman Empire collapsed, so did garum's popularity, which is probably for the best. Can you imagine explaining it at a modern dinner party? Oh yes, it's artisanal fish sauce, aged in clay amphorae with a top note of decomposition, but it never truly disappeared. Today, Southeast Asia has its own version, Nam Pla in Thailand, Nuoc Mam in Vietnam, and it's used the same way. Sparingly, sneakily, and with a surprising amount of culinary sophistication. So the next time you're seasoning your stir-fry with a dash of fish sauce, just remember, you're carrying on a proud tradition of eating things your ancestors first discovered by accident and then doubled down on out of sheer stubbornness. Next, let's fast forward to the Middle Ages, where hungry monks, creative peasants, and highly confused noblemen managed to turn beaver tails and rotten cheese with maggots into acceptable dinner options. Medieval Europe had rules, lots of rules, and most of them came from the church, which had opinions on what you could or couldn't eat, especially during Lent and on Fridays. Meat from land animals, forbidden. Fish, allowed. So naturally, some clever medieval theologians decided to play a little game of what counts as a fish. Enter the beaver. Yes, the furry dam builder. Because it spends so much time in the water, monks and bishops agreed that technically it could be classified as a fish. Specifically its tail, which was broad, scaly-looking, and apparently full of enough oil and fat to be roasted like a delicacy. So during Lent, when everyone else was sadly chewing turnips, lucky diners could enjoy a sizzling slice of beaver tail, guilt-free and church-approved. Imagine the sermon, "Thou shalt not eat beef, but this aquatic rodent's posterior, perfectly fine. And the beaver wasn't alone in this culinary identity crisis. In parts of Europe, barnacle geese, mysterious birds that migrated across seas, were thought to grow out of driftwood or barnacles. Since no one ever saw them nesting locally, some concluded they must actually grow from trees. And if they weren't really birds, then surely they counted as seafood. Congratulations, goose stew just made it onto the Lenten menu. This mix of loopholes and creative reasoning gave medieval diets a unique flavor. Animals weren't just food, they were philosophical puzzles. Is it meat? Is it fish? Is it morally acceptable to eat a platypus if you've never seen one before? The answer in medieval logic was, if it tastes good and you can argue about it in Latin, then yes. But beaver tails were just the beginning. Because while some foods were blessed by creative theology, others were simply cursed. Let's take a moment to discuss cheese that comes with maggots included, free of charge. Cheese, on the surface, seems safe. It's milk, but older, denser, and occasionally heroic when melted on bread. But in medieval and early modern Europe, cheese wasn't just a comfort food. Sometimes it was a culinary dare. Take casu marzu, a Sardinian delicacy whose name translates politely to rotten cheese. This was, and still is in some rural corners, a sheep's milk cheese deliberately infested with live maggots. Yes, you heard that correctly. Flies were invited. Invited! To lay eggs in the cheese. As the larvae hatched, they digested the fats, softening the cheese into a creamy, almost spreadable texture. Now, you might think, surely people scraped the maggots out before eating. Not always. Some insisted that the cheese was only safe to eat while the maggots were still alive. Dead maggots meant it had gone too far. Which raises the philosophical question, how far is too far when you're already eating cheese full of wriggling larvae? Descriptions of the experience suggest a sharp, spicy flavor, a strong smell, and the occasional acrobatic maggot leaping from the cheese straight at your face. Imagine inviting guests over, serving a platter, and then apologizing for the food trying to escape. The church and health authorities occasionally tried to ban casu marzu, calling it unclean, dangerous, or simply a bad idea. But the people of Sardinia defended it fiercely as a traditional delicacy. To them, it wasn't rotten. It was perfected. Proof, if ever you needed it, that one man's poison is another man's favorite sandwich spread. And casu marzu wasn't alone. Throughout Europe, strange cheeses appeared in markets. Blue moldy wheels smoked bricks, wheels washed in beer or wine. For peasants, cheese was a way to stretch milk through the lean months. For nobles, it was a chance to experiment, sometimes with results that modern food inspectors would politely decline. So if you thought pineapple on pizza was controversial, imagine debating whether or not your cheese should still be moving when you eat it. From there, things only got stranger. Because the Middle Ages also had a soft spot for foods that weren't just questionable in flavor, but questionable in origin. From powdered mummies to drinks made of literal gold. If you've ever thought your vitamin gummies tasted a little strange, spare a thought for the Europeans of the 16th and 17th centuries. Their supplements weren't just chalky, they were corpses. Yes, for several centuries it was perfectly fashionable, even recommended by doctors to consume powdered mummy. Real mummies, imported from Egypt. The logic was half medicine, half superstition. Ancient mummies were preserved with resin and bitumen, and European physicians, noticing their durability, concluded that mummified flesh must contain mystical healing powers. Grind it up, mix it with wine or water, and voila, a cure for headaches, stomach troubles, or just the general problem of existing in the early modern period. Kings, nobles, and even everyday patients indulged in mummy powder. Apothecaries stocked it in jars, sometimes labeled with impressive Latin names to make it feel less like people dust and more like legitimate medicine. One French king was said to carry a pouch of powdered mummy at all times, sprinkling it into drinks like some macabre sugar substitute. Of course, supplies from Egypt eventually ran low, at which point European opportunists began manufacturing, quote, fake mummies by robbing local graves, drying out the bodies, and selling the product to gullible physicians. Imagine walking into a pharmacy today and seeing, quote, organic, locally sourced corpse powder on the shelf. But mummies weren't the only bizarre consumables. Some wealthy diners like to sip wine laced with flakes of gold, not symbolic gold, real gold leaf. The theory was that since gold was pure and incorruptible, drinking it would transfer those qualities to your body. In reality, it just made for very expensive, glittery urine. Meanwhile, powdered skulls, ground-up bones, and unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, all made their way into diets, usually disguised as medicine. It wasn't dinner exactly, more like a nightmare smoothie, prescribed by the local doctor with absolute confidence. And while most of us today would prefer a simple aspirin, medieval and early modern Europeans lived by a rule we still half follow. If it's rare, expensive, and a little unsettling, it must be good for you. Up next, let's talk about drinks. Because while powdered pharaohs might have been medicinal, some medieval beverages were purely recreational and almost as questionable. We tend to think of history's beverages as romantic, mead in golden goblets, monks sipping fine wine, peasants clinking tankards of ale. And yes, all of that existed. But hidden among the beer barrels and wine cellars were drinks so bizarre they make kombucha look mainstream. Let's begin with the Vikings. You already know they loved their mead, honey wine brewed in smoky halls where someone was almost always shouting. But some warriors are believed to have experimented with something stronger, psychoactive mushroom brews. Specifically, drinks spiked with the red and white spotted toadstool, Amanita muscaria. This mushroom is both toxic and hallucinogenic. Prepared carefully, it doesn't kill you. Instead, it makes you sweat, shake, and occasionally believe you are invincible. Which, to be fair, was probably useful when storming a monastery. Contemporary reports describe berserkers, warriors in trance-like fury, foaming at the mouth, biting their shields, and generally behaving like heavy metal mascots before heavy metal existed. Was it the mushroom brew? Quite possibly. Imagine ordering that at a bar. One hallucinogenic frenzy, please. Extra foam. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, drinks weren't always about fun. Sometimes they were about health, in the most alarming sense. Take blood tonics. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it wasn't uncommon to drink fresh blood, usually from a recently executed criminal. The belief was that blood carried the essence of life, so consuming it might cure illnesses, seizures, or simply bad vibes. Executioners' assistants sometimes made pocket money selling cups of warm blood to desperate onlookers. Think of it as the world's worst food truck. And then, of course, there was the daily beer. Not strange in itself, but strange in how universal it was. In the Middle Ages, people drank small beer, weakly alcoholic, brewed daily, and consumed by everyone, including children. Why? Because water was too risky. Streams looked clear, but upstream someone was probably dumping a chamber pot into it, so beer was the safe choice. Hydration with a buzz. So whether you were a Viking chasing hallucinations, a desperate patient sipping blood, or just a peasant trying not to die of dysentery, drinks were less about pleasure and more about survival, or, occasionally, spiritual fireworks. Now, having washed it all down, let's see what's for dessert. Spoiler, it's probably not chocolate cake. When we picture medieval desserts, we might imagine honey cakes, candied fruits, maybe a pie or two cooling on a stone windowsill. The reality? Sometimes charming, often alarming. Let's start with sugar. Today, it's cheap, everywhere, and slowly plotting against our teeth. But in the Middle Ages, sugar was a luxury, as rare and expensive as spices. Nobles used it to show off, commissioning elaborate sugar sculptures for banquets. Castles, ships, animals, even entire battle scenes, all made of crystallized sweetness. Imagine spending a week carving a sugar fortress, only for your guests to gnaw on it politely, like beavers at a log. And then there were the pies. Some were filled with meat, others with fruit, but for maximum entertainment value, nobles sometimes baked pies designed to explode when cut open, not with fireworks, but with live animals. Birds, frogs, even the occasional squirrel were placed inside the hollow crust. When the pie was sliced, they would burst out, fluttering or leaping across the banquet hall. It was the medieval equivalent of a dinner in a show, except your dessert was trying to escape. If that sounds familiar, it's because of the nursery rhyme. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. Not just a cute verse. It actually happened. Poor blackbirds. Poor dinner guests. For the ultra-wealthy, dessert might include flakes of edible gold sprinkled on cakes and wine. It didn't taste of much, but it glittered under candlelight and, more importantly, reminded everyone at the table that you were rich enough to literally eat money. And finally, let's not forget the Italians and their early love of marzipan, a sweet almond paste shaped into fruits, animals, or occasionally very realistic sculptures of saints. Nothing quite says blessed are the meek, like biting into an almond-flavored apostle. So, while peasants were chewing turnips and dreaming of stale bread crusts, nobles were tucking into sugar castles, glittering cakes, and pies that doubled as bird sanctuaries. Dessert wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle. But if dessert was theatrical, the main courses could be downright bizarre. Let's peek at the dinner table of a medieval king, where roasted animals didn't always stay in one piece. Sometimes they were stitched together like something out of a culinary horror story. Medieval nobles didn't just eat to live, they dined to impress, and sometimes to terrify. Banquets were theater, and food was the stage prop. The stranger, the grander, the better. One favorite spectacle was the cockentrice. Imagine taking the front half of a pig and sewing it onto the back half of a goose. Or sometimes the other way around, depending on the chef's mood. The stitched creature was then roasted whole and presented to astonished guests, who hopefully had the courtesy not to scream. The point wasn't taste. The point was shock value. A cockentrice said, "Yes, I have money, a personal cook, and apparently way too much free time." But why stop there? Sometimes animals were cooked and then redressed in their own feathers or fur, posed as if still alive. Picture a roasted peacock, carefully refeathered and placed back on the table with its plumes spread in all its glory. It looked magnificent. It tasted, well, like roasted peacock, which is to say, stringy and unimpressive. But no one cared. It was medieval food cosplay. Other times, entire animals were stuffed inside each other like culinary Russian dolls. A goose stuffed with a chicken, stuffed with a pigeon, stuffed with an egg. This idea survives today in the more modest turducken, but the medieval version was larger, stranger, and frequently flammable. Yes, sometimes they even poured alcohol over the dish and set it alight before serving. Nothing says good appetite like a fire hazard waddling across the banquet table. For the ordinary peasant, hearing about these banquets must have been like scrolling through Instagram food accounts while chewing a turnip. Meanwhile, nobles were essentially commissioning edible circus acts. But it wasn't all poultry Frankenstein monsters and flaming geese. Some noble delicacies involved foods so rare and precious, Wars were fought to control their trade. Which brings us to the most expensive grocery item of the medieval world: spices. Today, pepper is that humble little shaker on every table, waiting to rescue bland pasta. But in the Middle Ages, pepper wasn't humble at all. It was treasure. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger traveled thousands of miles from Asia to European markets. Each shipment was an odyssey involving desert caravans, monsoon winds, and merchants who absolutely knew how to jack up the price. By the time peppercorns reached a medieval kitchen, they were worth more, pound for pound, than precious metals. In fact, pepper was sometimes used as currency. Debts were paid in pepper, rents collected in pepper. Imagine your landlord today asking for 3 sacks of seasoning instead of a bank transfer. It sounds absurd, but in medieval Europe, that was a respectable financial transaction. Nutmeg had its own notorious story. Europeans became so obsessed with it that entire wars were fought to control the islands where it grew. Small, distant specks in the Indian Ocean became the most contested real estate on Earth, all because some noble in France wanted his mulled wine to taste fancier. For peasants, of course, spices were a fantasy. A sprinkle of black pepper might cost a week's wages, so they flavored their stews with onions, leeks, garlic, and hope. Meanwhile, nobles gleefully dumped handfuls of exotic spices into everything, not just to enjoy the taste, but to prove they could afford to. A heavily spiced dish wasn't just food. It was a flex, and sometimes it was downright overwhelming. Recipes survive describing meat pies containing pounds of cinnamon and ginger. Think less subtle seasoning and more Christmas candle in your face. But to medieval nobles, subtlety was overrated. If your guests weren't coughing politely from spice overload, were you even entertaining them properly? Spices were more than flavor. They were medicine, luxury, and status rolled into one. And they explain why medieval food often reads to us as either bland turnip porridge or hilariously overseasoned banquets. Next, let's look at how desperation shaped the menu. Because when harvests failed and pantries emptied, people turned to meals that today would qualify more as survival stunts than recipes. If spices were the crown jewels of the medieval pantry, bread was its battered old workhorse. Everyone ate it, every day. Rich or poor, feast or famine, bread was the foundation of life, which meant when harvests failed, people got creative. A peasant's loaf wasn't the soft, fluffy sourdough you're imagining. It was dark, heavy, and chewy, made with coarse rye or barley flour. Sometimes it was so dense it doubled as a spoon. You ate stew by pouring it onto your bread and then eating the soggy slab underneath. Medieval people even had a word for this edible plate: a trencher. Imagine eating dinner off your plate and then eating the plate itself. Convenient, yes. Delicious, debatable. But when famine struck, even bad bread was a luxury. Grain supplies dwindled, and bakers stretched flour with anything they could find: acorns, beans, ground-up peas, even sawdust and bark. These famine loaves were technically edible, but came with side effects ranging from stomach cramps to actual poisoning. Picture biting into bread that tastes like wet plywood, and you'll get the idea. And then there was ergot. This toxic fungus grew on rye, and when ground into flour could cause hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and sometimes death. Entire communities fell sick after eating infected bread, stumbling through fields in fits that looked suspiciously like possession. Some historians even suspect ergot poisoning contributed to medieval tales of witches and mass hysteria. Imagine trying to explain to your priest that you weren't cursed, you just had one too many slices of fungus toast. For nobles, famine was less dire. They could import grain or simply eat more meat. But for peasants, bad bread meant a bad year, a bad stomach, and sometimes a short life. Still, bread was so central to medieval identity that the word itself symbolized life. Breaking bread was a sacred ritual. Bread crusts were given to beggars as charity, and bakers were heavily regulated. Caught shortchanging flour, and you might be publicly shamed or worse. So next time you toss a stale crust in the bin, remember, to a medieval peasant, even bark-flavored bread was better than nothing. But desperation didn't stop with bread. When cupboards were bare, people turned to wild foods, plants, roots, and in some cases, creatures we'd hesitate to call dinner today. When times were good, medieval peasants ate bread, pottage, a thick stew of whatever was available, and maybe the occasional bit of cheese or salted pork. When times were bad, they turned to, well, whatever wasn't nailed down. Fields and forests became emergency supermarkets. Nettles, dandelions, chickweed, and thistles. Plants modern gardeners curse were boiled into bitter soups. Not because they were delicious, but because they weren't poisonous and grew without permission. Recipes survived for nettle stew, which was essentially boiled green mush with a pinch of salt, if you had any. Think of it as medieval kale smoothie, but without the Instagram appeal. Roots like parsnips, turnips, and beets were staples, though often eaten raw or barely cooked. Some unlucky peasants gnawed on tree bark or chewed leather scraps in true emergencies. Archaeologists have even found evidence of starvation food in skeletons, bones showing signs of malnutrition after winters spent eating nothing but foraged weeds. And then there were animals, not the plump roast goose of noble feasts, but anything small, catchable, and vaguely edible. Hedgehogs were roasted after being rolled in clay. Once the clay baked hard, it was cracked open, taking the spines with it. Frogs, snails, and dormice all made appearances on the poorer end of the menu, though nobles sometimes ate them too, just to prove they could. One particularly creative survival strategy came from Scandinavia, burying fish in the ground, letting it ferment, and digging it up weeks later for a meal. This gave us dishes like surströmming, still eaten in Sweden today, a food so pungent it's legally banned on airplanes. To medieval peasants, though, it was calories. Smelly, wriggly memories aside, it kept you alive. It's easy to laugh now, sitting comfortably with stocked pantries and 24-hour grocery stores. But in the medieval world, winter could stretch hunger into a slow, grinding threat. Eating weeds and hedgehogs wasn't quirky. It was survival. Still, when the harvests were good and lords weren't demanding too much tax, peasants sometimes had feasts of their own. And while their food was simpler, the joy of gathering, sharing, and eating together wasn't so different from ours. Next, let's climb back up the social ladder and peek into the kitchens of royalty, where meals were not just about food, but about power, politics, and a very dramatic performance of wealth. For kings and queens, dinner wasn't dinner, it was theater. Every roast, every goblet of wine, every poor servant carrying a flaming peacock across the hall was part of a performance designed to say, "Look at me, I am wealthy, I am powerful. And yes, I can afford to waste food just to impress you." Royal banquets could last hours, sometimes days. They began with processions, nobles entering the hall, trumpets blaring, the king seated on a raised dais like the star of a very slow play. Servants brought dish after dish, not 2 or 3, but dozens. Records from English courts mention feasts with over 30 courses, each more elaborate than the last. The menu read like a bestiary. Swan roasted and redressed in feathers, boar's head carried in with music, roasted deer, porpoise, yes, the sea mammal, and heron. Sometimes entire animals were gilded with gold leaf, shimmering under candlelight, as guests politely tried not to choke on metallic flakes. But the real message wasn't the food itself, it was the scale. A medieval king might slaughter hundreds of oxen, sheep, and pigs just for one festival, feeding not only nobles but also commoners gathered outside the hall. The spectacle said, "I am so rich I can eat for an army and still have leftovers." And feasts weren't only about excess, they were political networking events. Deals were struck, alliances whispered over goblets, marriages arranged between bites of roasted crane. Eating at the king's table wasn't just a privilege. It was a statement of loyalty, rank, and influence. Of course, the food itself sometimes went largely uneaten. Nobles sampled a little here, a little there, before dishes were whisked away. Much of it ended up feeding servants or the poor at the gates, not out of generosity, but because wasting food entirely was bad optics, even for a monarch. So when you hear of medieval kings feasting, don't imagine them happily munching pies. Imagine them managing a stage show, where every dish was another prop in the ongoing drama of monarchy. But not all feasts were royal. Villages, towns, and guilds also held communal celebrations, where food was less about intimidation and more about joy. Next, let's wander down from the castle into the village green, where harvest festivals brought whole communities together, sometimes with more ale than common sense. For most of the year, peasants ate humbly: bread, pottage, maybe a scrap of salted meat if luck allowed. But festivals were different. Harvest time, saints, days, weddings, or even just the Lord deciding he felt generous. These were moments when ordinary people could feast like nobles, at least for a night. Picture the scene: a village square decked with garlands, tables piled with bread loaves, roast meats, and jugs of ale. Musicians playing pipes and fiddles, children darting between benches, dogs circling hopefully for scraps. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting pork, a rare indulgence saved for special days. At a harvest festival, whole animals might be spit roasted over open fires. Ale flowed freely, not the weak, small beer of daily life, but stronger brews that guaranteed half the village would be singing loudly by midnight. Communal pies big enough to feed dozens were baked in shared ovens. And everyone, from the poorest farmhand to the village priest, sat shoulder to shoulder. Food was simpler than in noble halls, but no less meaningful. Pork, beef, and chicken were prized. Fresh vegetables and fruits, usually too precious to waste, were suddenly abundant. Spices? Perhaps not. But herbs from gardens, sage, thyme, parsley, added a rustic fragrance that nobles, drowning their food in cinnamon, often missed. And then there were the contests. Who could eat the most bread? Who could drink the most ale without falling into the fire? Who could dance longest on the rough wooden boards laid across the grass? These feasts were as much about community as about food, a reminder that survival was hard, but joy was still possible. For many peasants, festival days were among the only times they ate meat in real quantity. They stretched out the memory for weeks after, telling stories of who said what, who sang off-key, and who made a fool of themselves after too much beer. In a life where every day was toil, a feast was a glimpse of something larger, brighter, and almost royal. But whether rich or poor, all medieval people shared one thing. Food wasn't just about taste, it was about belief. Meals came wrapped in superstition, ritual, and prayers. And so, before we close, let's look at the spiritual side of the medieval table, where bread could be holy, wine could be blood, and dinner might just save your soul. In the medieval world, eating was never just eating. Every meal carried a layer of ritual, superstition, or outright theology. Food could nourish your body, but it might also save or endanger your soul. Bread, for instance, wasn't just bread. At its most sacred, it became the Eucharist, the literal body of Christ, according to Catholic belief. Priests consecrated wafers of bread during Mass, transforming them into holy substance. Ordinary loaves, too, were treated with reverence. Dropping bread on the floor was more than clumsiness. It was seen as an insult to God's gift. Families often made the sign of the cross over their loaves before slicing them, a gesture both of blessing and of gratitude. Wine had its dual identity as well. Daily drink for the wealthy, sacred blood of Christ at the altar. Even ale had superstitions. Spilling it on the floor was thought unlucky, while sharing it sealed bonds of friendship and loyalty. Meals began and ended with prayer. Grace before eating wasn't just a polite nod. It was insurance, thanking God for the food and asking protection from illness, demons, and the occasional suspicious-looking stew. Monks, in particular, treated meals like extensions of worship, eaten in silence, punctuated by scripture readings, food measured not by appetite but by discipline. Superstition flavored food too. Garlic was eaten not just for taste, but as a ward against evil spirits. Eggs were sometimes blessed before hatching season, to protect chickens and farmers alike. Fish had symbolic meanings. Christ was likened to a fish, so eating it on holy days reinforced the link between diet and devotion. Even fasting, giving up certain foods during Lent or on Fridays, shaped society profoundly. Whole industries developed around Lenten loopholes, like our friend the beaver tail masquerading as fish. Faith determined menus as much as seasons did. So when a medieval person sat down to eat, they weren't just filling their stomach. They were negotiating survival, community, and eternity, all with the same wooden spoon. And with that, we've reached the end of our little culinary journey, from Roman fish sauce to maggot cheese, from famine bread to royal banquets, from survival nettles to sacred wafers. Strange? Yes. Disgusting? Occasionally. But every bite tells us something about how people lived, struggled, celebrated, and believed. When you imagine a medieval banquet, perhaps you picture a grand hall lit by torches, nobles in fine robes, servants bustling with silver platters, and everyone dining with elegance. The reality? Well, let's just say you probably wouldn't want to sit too close to anyone. Medieval eating was a communal affair, and table manners as we think of them today were still very much in progress. In fact, some of the earliest books of etiquette from the 13th and 14th centuries survived precisely because people needed them, which is a polite way of saying behavior at the table was out of control. First, there were the hands. Everyone ate with them. Forks hadn't caught on yet, more on that in the next block. So most food was cut with personal knives and scooped with fingers or, occasionally, spoons. Imagine a roast goose arriving at the table. Instead of being neatly carved by one person, guests might all reach in, slicing off hunks of meat for themselves. The grease ran down their hands, and with no napkins, diners simply wiped them on the tablecloth, or on their neighbor's sleeve if they weren't paying attention. Some manuals even warn, "Do not clean your fingers on the tablecloth, for others must also eat there." Which suggests, of course, that plenty of people did exactly that. Then there was the issue of bones and scraps. Once you'd gnawed all you could from a bone, you didn't set it aside neatly, you tossed it. Onto the floor, dogs, cats, or even pigs wandered banquet halls, eagerly snapping up discarded morsels. After a royal feast, the floor looked less like a dining room and more like the aftermath of a battle. Greasy bones, half-chewed crusts, puddles of spilled ale, and the occasional guest snoring under the table. And speaking of ale, drinking customs were equally chaotic. Cups and goblets were often shared, passed from hand to hand. This wasn't optional. Refusing to share a drink could be taken as an insult, as if you didn't trust your companion. So yes, backwash was part of the deal. Guests also liked to toast frequently, clashing mugs in loud shows of camaraderie. A famous piece of etiquette advice warned drinkers not to gulp so much ale that they spluttered across the table. Again, one assumes this was a common problem. Spitting was another battlefield in the war of table manners. Some sources begged diners not to spit across the table, or into shared bowls, or onto the floor where dogs were already feasting. The fact that this needed to be written down tells you everything. And if that weren't enough, people also blew their noses directly into their hands before continuing to eat. Imagine reaching for the bread trencher after that. What about personal space? Forget it. Seating was crowded. Tables were long planks set up for the occasion, with benches crammed tight. Guests sat shoulder to shoulder, sometimes two to a trencher. That is, an edible plate of stale bread used as a base for meat and gravy. When you're literally sharing the same piece of bread as your dinner partner, you learn quickly not to be squeamish. Of course, not everyone approved of this chaos. Manuals written for young nobles and courtiers tried to impose some order. Chew with your mouth closed, don't talk while eating, don't scratch your head over the food, and, my favorite, don't pick your teeth with your knife while speaking to your neighbor. Imagine being the poor scribe tasked with writing that one down, because Lord Geoffrey wouldn't stop doing it. Still, for all the mess, medieval feasting was joyful. Music played, people laughed, food was shared, and manners, however loose, reinforced bonds of community. It wasn't about looking elegant. It was about being part of the group, grease-stained sleeves and all. Next, we'll explore the tools, or lack thereof, that made this style of eating possible. Because forks, believe it or not, were once considered scandalous. When you sit down to eat today, you probably take for granted the tidy arrangement of fork, knife, and spoon, maybe even chopsticks, depending on the meal. But for much of the Middle Ages, dining looked very different. If you were a medieval diner, your main utensil was yourself. The knife was king of the table. Not the neat little butter knife we think of today, but a personal blade you carried everywhere. In fact, guests were expected to bring their own knife to feasts. The host provided the food, the fire, and sometimes even the ale, but not the utensils. That was your problem. Your knife wasn't just for slicing meat at the table, it was also your utility tool, your belt accessory, and, if things got out of hand after too much ale, your weapon. A medieval dinner could go from carving goose to carving insults remarkably quickly. Spoons also existed, though they weren't standardized. Some were carved from wood, some fashioned from horn, and wealthier diners had metal ones of pewter or even silver. Spoons were mostly for soups, porridges, and desserts. Anything too liquid to pick up with your hands. But sharing was common. A pot of pottage sat in the middle of the table, and several diners might dip into it at once, each with their own spoon. A certain amount of double dipping was simply part of life. And then there was the fork question. Forks did exist in the medieval world, but they were far from mainstream. Two-pronged table forks had been used in Byzantium since at least the 10th century. Wealthy Italian families, connected to Eastern trade, began adopting them in the 11th and 12th centuries. But when forks first appeared in Western Europe, they were controversial. Clerics, in particular, frowned upon them. Why? Because forks seemed decadent, unnecessary, and, frankly, a little insulting to God. The argument went like this. God gave you perfectly good fingers. Why invent extra prongs of metal to do what your hands already could? Using a fork was seen by some as a display of vanity. In one famous case, a Byzantine princess who used a fork at the Venetian court was criticized by churchmen as frivolous and wasteful. So for centuries, most Europeans continued to eat with knives, spoons, and fingers. Food was torn apart, dipped, scooped, and slurped with gusto. The fork only gained wider acceptance in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, spreading from Italy to France and finally to the rest of Europe. Even then, it took time before anyone thought it normal. In England, forks weren't common until the 17th century, and even then many found them fussy. Meanwhile, the poor had even fewer options. Most peasants didn't own much cutlery at all. A shared wooden spoon in the family hut, maybe a rough knife if you were lucky, and beyond that, fingers. Bread often doubled as both plate and utensil. A hunk of coarse rye bread served as your trencher, soaking up gravy and acting as both dish and sponge. When you finished eating, you either ate the trencher itself or gave it to the dogs. No dishes, no washing up. Very efficient, if a little chewy. So when we imagine medieval dining, we shouldn't see neat place settings and polite forks. Instead, picture a hall full of people carving meat with belt knives, scooping stew with mismatched spoons, grabbing hunks of bread, and licking fingers clean before reaching for more. Messy? Certainly. But it worked. Next, we'll step back into the world of nobles, where the quest for culinary spectacle led to some shocking choices. Exotic animals on the menu, from peacocks to porpoises. If you've ever been to a fancy restaurant and thought the menu sounded a bit pretentious, perhaps pan-seared pheasant with truffle dust, just know that medieval nobles would have laughed and said, "Cute." But where's the dolphin? That's not a joke. Records from royal kitchens in England and France include recipes for porpoise and dolphin, served roasted, stewed, or in thick sauces. Not because they were particularly delicious, reports suggest they were chewy, oily, and vaguely unpleasant, but because they were rare. If you had porpoise on your table, it meant you controlled ships, seas, and trade. It was less about taste and more about prestige, the medieval equivalent of ordering champagne you don't actually like, just to show you can. And dolphins weren't alone. Let's talk about swan. Today we think of swans as elegant creatures gliding across lakes, symbols of romance and grace. In the Middle Ages, they were dinner. Roasted swan was a luxury dish, often redressed in its own feathers for maximum spectacle. Imagine a gleaming roasted bird arriving at the banquet table, then carefully fitted back into its snowy plumage, head held high, wings spread, a feast that looked alive even as it was being carved. Taste-wise, swan was tough and gamey. But who cared? It looked stunning. Then there was the peacock, another feathered centerpiece. Like swans, peacocks were roasted, then re-feathered and displayed as if strutting in full plumage. Sometimes cooks even placed hot coals inside the body so that sparks shot from the beak, creating a fiery bird centerpiece that doubled as a pyrotechnic show. Guests were dazzled. Whether anyone enjoyed chewing through peacock drumsticks afterward is another story. Hedgehogs also made an appearance, though in a very different way. Recipes survived for hedgehogs baked in pastry or roasted after being rolled in clay. Once the clay hardened, cracking it open removed the spines, leaving behind the meat. Some cooks even shaped ground meat into fake hedgehogs, spiking them with almond slivers to mimic quills. Think of it as the medieval version of novelty meatloaf. And then we have the beaver, which, thanks to its aquatic lifestyle, often got classified as a fish, especially useful during Lent. The tail, rich in fat, was considered a delicacy. Monks, bound by religious fasting rules, could enjoy it guilt-free, declaring it holy loophole cuisine. Somewhere, a monk probably thought he was being very clever while tucking into beaver tail stew. For nobles, serving exotic creatures wasn't just about food. It was a power statement. If your guests sat down to porpoise, peacock, and swan, they knew you had money, connections, and the ability to command the rarest beasts to your table. It was medieval one-upmanship at its finest. Meanwhile, peasants looked on, gnawing their bark-flavored bread and nettle stew, muttering about the absurdity of eating swans while their children were chewing roots. The culinary gap between rich and poor was enormous, and nowhere was it clearer than in the animal kingdom of the noble table. But if nobles sometimes dined like kings of the jungle, what happened afterward? Surely all this food didn't just vanish. Which brings us to the curious history of leftovers, and the long medieval chain of who ate what once the lords had finished showing off. If you've ever opened your fridge to find a sad little container of yesterday's pasta, you already understand the problem of leftovers. In the Middle Ages, there were no fridges, no microwaves, no cling film, and yet feasts regularly produced mountains of uneaten food. So what happened to it all? At noble banquets, the first rule was display. Cooks prepared far more food than anyone could possibly eat. A lord's power wasn't measured by how satisfied his guests were, but by how overwhelmed they felt in the face of endless platters. Dozens of courses arrived in sequence, many barely touched before being whisked away for the next. It was culinary theater, and like any theater, the props had to be stored somewhere after the curtain fell. So, step 1. The servants. Once the nobles had taken their bites and murmured their compliments, the dishes often went down the hierarchy. Servants ate what their masters had nibbled at. Not glamorous, perhaps, but still leagues better than peasant fare. Imagine being a kitchen boy sneaking away with a half-carved swan leg or a slab of venison pie that never reached the table. For many in the household staff, leftovers were the only chance to taste luxury. Step 2. The poor. Medieval society emphasized charity, and feeding the hungry was a duty as much as a virtue. Many lords allowed the needy to gather outside the castle gates during banquets. After the feast, scraps and trenchers, those thick slabs of stale bread used as plates, were handed out. These trenchers had soaked up the juices of meat and sauces, making them flavorful treasures for peasants who otherwise lived on gruel. It wasn't generosity alone, it was also good politics. A lord who fed the poor was respected. One who wasted food risked resentment. Step 3. Preservation. For the food that remained in the kitchen, cooks had to be inventive. Meat was salted, smoked, or boiled again into stews. Fish might be dried or pickled. Pies, with their thick crusts, acted as medieval Tupperware, keeping contents edible for several days. Still, without refrigeration, leftovers had a short life. If they weren't eaten quickly, they went bad. And sometimes people ate them anyway with predictable results. There's even evidence that leftover distribution was carefully recorded. In some royal households, officials kept track of who received which scraps, ensuring hierarchy was respected even in the afterlife of food. A knight might get the remains of a venison roast. The poor might get trenchers. The dogs finally got the bones. Nothing was wasted. Not because people were eco-conscious, but because waste was dangerous in a world where famine was always one bad harvest away. Peasant households had their own system. With little food to spare, leftovers were simply tomorrow's breakfast. Yesterday's pottage became today's pottage, with new vegetables added to the same simmering pot. Some stews cooked for days, even weeks, with ingredients constantly recycled. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. So while modern people complain about soggy pizza or a forgotten salad, medieval people had a very different relationship with leftovers. They were survival, charity, and even politics. A king's banquet might fill bellies across an entire village, days after the last goblet was drained. But with so much food circulating, there was also danger. Because sometimes, meals weren't just generous or showy, they were deadly. And in the high-stakes world of medieval courts, poison was always a possibility. If you were a medieval noble, dinner wasn't just a time to show off your wealth. It was also a dangerous game, because for all the swans, porpoises, and sugar castles, one dish could carry more than flavor. It could carry betrayal. The fear of poison haunted medieval courts. In a world where alliances shifted as quickly as the seasons, a discreet cup of wine or a bowl of stew offered the perfect opportunity for assassination. Why risk swords and open rebellion when a sprinkle of powder in the kitchen could do the work silently? Some rulers became almost paranoid about food safety. Servants known as tasters sampled every dish before it reached the lord's lips. Their job was simple: take a bite, wait a few minutes, and see if they keeled over. If they survived, dinner was considered safe. Of course, this system had flaws. Many poisons acted slowly, so tasters might pass the test, only for their master to suffer later. Still, the ritual gave nobles peace of mind, or at least the illusion of it. Poison lore was a mixture of science, superstition, and outright fantasy. Some believed certain gems or metals could detect poison, dipping a ring into wine to see if it changed color, or trusting that a unicorn horn cup would neutralize toxins. Spoiler: unicorns were not involved. These magical items were usually narwhal tusks or carved ivory, sold at outrageous prices to frighten nobles. The most feared poisons included arsenic, hemlock, and belladonna. Stories of infamous poisoners circulated through Europe. Italian families rumored to keep secret recipes, shadowy alchemists brewing powders in candlelit rooms. Some accounts are exaggerated. Gossip always grows darker in retelling, but the fear was real enough that meals became tense political arenas. And then there's the irony. Food itself was often poisonous without anyone trying. Spoiled meat, contaminated bread, or fish, past its prime, could kill just as easily as any assassin's vial. A noble might suspect treachery, when in reality, it was simply a case of bad preservation. Imagine glaring suspiciously at your cousin across the table, while the true culprit is the dubious venison pie. Even with tasters and charms, paranoia lingered. Some kings refused to eat in public, retreating to private chambers, where trusted servants prepared simple, carefully guarded meals. Others leaned into spectacle, daring enemies to try anything under the watchful eyes of dozens of courtiers. To be poisoned at a banquet was more than murder. It was humiliation, a reminder that even a king was vulnerable at the table. Yet, for all the fear, poisonings were rare compared to the endless rumors. Most nobles died, not from cunning plots, but from disease, infection, or their own overindulgence in food and drink. Still, the possibility of poison added a sharp edge to every goblet of wine, a shadow lurking over every gilded platter. And if paranoia wasn't enough, feasting came with another risk: sheer excess. Because after hours of nonstop eating and drinking, the problem wasn't poison, it was digestion. We've talked about the spectacle of medieval banquets. The swans redressed in feathers, the pies bursting with live birds, the oceans of wine. But what happened after the feast? Well, let's just say digestion wasn't medieval Europe's strong point. First, the sheer volume of food. A great feast could include 30, 40, even 50 courses. Nobles weren't expected to eat everything, but sampling each dish quickly added up. Chroniclers record diners staggering away from tables, groaning with fullness, clutching their stomachs like they'd swallowed a cannonball. And yet, leaving too early or refusing too many dishes might insult your host. So nobles soldiered on, mouths full, eyes watering, determined to prove they could eat like kings, because, of course, they were. Next came the remedies. Medieval medicine believed in balancing the humors, and overindulgence was thought to tip the scales. The solution? Strong digestive aids. After dinner, nobles might sip spiced wine, chew fennel seeds, or drink herbal tonics laced with mint, anise, or ginger. Some physicians even recommended vomiting as a way to reset the stomach. Imagine finishing a feast, stepping aside discreetly, and then returning cheerfully for the dancing. The problem wasn't just overeating. The food itself was often heavy: rich sauces, fatty meats, and dense bread. Combine that with gallons of ale and wine, and you had a recipe for medieval indigestion. No Pepto-Bismol, no antacids, just prayers, herbal poultices, and the hope that you didn't have to attend another banquet the next day. And let's not forget the hangovers. Wine flowed freely at noble tables, and small beer, the weaker daily brew, was replaced at feasts with stronger, headier varieties. Drinking was a social obligation. To refuse a toast was rude, and to fall asleep under the table was common. The morning after a feast, the castle corridors probably smelled less like incense and more like a brewery exploded. Remedies for hangovers included sour vinegar drinks, cabbage soup, and sometimes the medieval classic, just keep drinking. But the aftermath wasn't only physical. Feasts were political events, and what happened during them echoed afterward. Who sat where? Who spoke with whom? Who gifted what? These details mattered. A noble might spend weeks replaying conversations and alliances forged over roast venison. In that sense, the true digestion of a feast wasn't just about food, but about power. For peasants, the aftermath of feasting looked different. After village festivals, bellies were full, but so were heads, thanks to strong ale. Singing might echo through the night, but the next day came with sore limbs, splitting headaches, and the return of hard labor. Still, the memory of meat, laughter, and plenty lingered, enough to sustain spirits until the next rare occasion. So whether you were a king on a gilded dais or a farmer by the fire, the aftermath of feasting was always a mix of joy, discomfort, and reflection. The food might vanish, but the stories and the stomachaches remained. And with that, we've nearly finished our long banquet through history. But before we wrap up, let's move to one final course, a calm conclusion to tie everything together and let you drift softly into sleep. And so, we've reached the end of our midnight meal through history. We've sampled Roman garum, fish guts turned into liquid gold. We've chewed our way through medieval beaver tails, maggoty cheese, and porpoises dressed as prestige. We've sat in noble halls, wiping our greasy hands on tablecloths, and crouched in peasant huts, scraping nettle stew from the pot. We've seen sugar castles and pies that burst with live birds, trenchers soaked in gravy handed to beggars, and the paranoia of poisoned goblets. If there's a single thread tying it all together, it's this: food has never just been about eating. It's been about survival, spectacle, politics, superstition, and sometimes sheer absurdity. What people put on the table said as much about their world as their crowns, their castles, or their cathedrals. Of course, from our modern perspective, much of it sounds bizarre, even disgusting. But perhaps, centuries from now, people will look back at us with the same amused horror. They ate what? Burgers from paper bags? Powdered cheese dust from shiny orange packets? Entire cakes shaped like unicorns? Every age has its peculiar delicacies. For now, we can simply smile at the thought of a medieval noble proudly serving a flaming peacock, or a poor farmer happily tucking into a rare slice of pork at a harvest festival. Strange as it all seems, these meals were filled with the same joy, laughter, and sometimes indigestion that we still know today. So as you drift into sleep, maybe imagine yourself at one of those feasts. The hall is dim with torchlight, the music soft, the laughter rolling. A goblet of wine passes your way. A plate of questionable stew lands in front of you. Would you take a bite? Or would you politely decline, muttering something about already being full? Either way, the dream is yours to savor. Thank you for listening, for liking, for subscribing, and for sharing these odd, sleepy stories. May your own meals tonight be far less adventurous, and may your sleep be free of maggot cheese and flaming birds. Good night.